Welcome to Gripping Tales. Are you ready for today's video? It starts now.
Working at a funeral home isn't like other jobs. You're dealing with death every single day. You're around the deceased constantly. You work late nights in empty buildings where the only other people present can't speak, can't move, can't do anything. Most funeral home workers will tell you it's just a job. You get used to it. The dead are just bodies. There's nothing to fear. But sometimes, something happens that reminds you that you're working in a place where the boundary between life and death is thinner than anywhere else. Something that makes you question whether the dead are really as still and silent as they're supposed to be. Tonight I'm sharing 5 true stories from funeral home workers, embalmers, morticians, night attendants, who experienced something they can't explain. Something that still haunts them years later. Something that made them wonder if they're ever really alone in those preparation rooms. These are their stories. Let's begin. Story number 1, the sitting corpse. This story comes from Derek Mills, who worked as an embalmer at a funeral home in Cleveland, Ohio in 2016. Derek had been in the profession for 8 years. He'd embalmed hundreds of bodies. Nothing fazed him anymore, or so he thought. One Thursday evening around 9 p.m., Derek was working alone in the preparation room. He'd just finished embalming an elderly man who died of natural causes. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. Derek left the body on the preparation table while he cleaned his equipment. The body was lying flat, arms at its sides, exactly as Derek had positioned it. Derek was at the sink, his back to the table, when he heard something, a creaking sound, like weight shifting on the metal table. He turned around. The body was sitting up. Not fully upright, but propped up at about a 45-degree angle, arms still at its sides, head tilted forward. Derek froze. His rational mind told him this was impossible. The body had been flat 2 minutes ago. There was no one else in the room. Bodies don't just sit up. But there it was, sitting, staring down at its own chest with dead, half-open eyes. Derek stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then his training kicked in. He walked over to the table, placed his hands on the body's shoulders, and gently pushed it back down into a lying position. The body was stiff, cold. It resisted slightly as he pushed it down, as if rigor mortis was fighting the movement, but Derek got it flat again. He stepped back and stared at the body. It remained still. Derek tried to rationalize what had happened. Rigor mortis can cause muscle contractions. Gas buildup in the body can create movement. Maybe the angle of the table had shifted. Maybe he'd positioned the body in an unstable way and gravity had caused it to settle into a different position. But none of those explanations fit what Derek had seen. The body had been completely flat, and the movement wasn't a slump or a slide. It was an upward movement against gravity, as if something had pulled it into a sitting position. Derek finished his work as quickly as possible and left the preparation room. He didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe him? But it happened again 2 weeks later. Different body, same thing. Derek was embalming a middle-aged woman who died in a car accident. He stepped away from the table to get supplies. When he turned back, the woman was sitting up. Same angle, same position. Arms at sides, head tilted forward. This time, Derek didn't touch her immediately. He just stood there, watching, waiting to see if the body would move again. It didn't. It just sat there. After about 30 seconds, Derek pushed the body back down. This time, he checked everything. The table angle, the body position, the floor level, everything was fine. There was no mechanical or physical reason for the body to sit up. But it had, twice now. Derek started dreading the preparation room. Every time he worked on a body, he'd watch it constantly, waiting for it to move. Most times, nothing happened. But occasionally, maybe once every few months, a body would shift position when Derek's back was turned. Never in dramatic ways. Never when he was looking directly at it. But he'd leave a body lying down and return to find it turned slightly to one side. Or he'd position arms across the chest and come back to find them back at the sides. Derek talked to other embalmers. Some laughed it off. Some admitted they'd experienced similar things, but chalked it up to gases and muscle contractions. One older embalmer told Derek, "The dead don't like being positioned. They move back to where they're comfortable." Derek didn't find that comforting. He quit the funeral home after 2 years. The final straw was when he was working late one night, alone in the building, and heard footsteps in the hallway outside the preparation room. Slow, shuffling footsteps. Derek called out, "Hello? Someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Derek opened the door and looked down the hallway. It was empty. All the viewing rooms were dark. The front entrance was locked. But when Derek turned back to the preparation room, the body he'd been working on, a man in his 70s, was no longer on the table. It was standing beside the table. Still dead, still stiff, but somehow upright, leaning against the edge of the table, as if it had tried to get down and couldn't quite make it. Derek quit the next day. He left the funeral industry entirely, and now works in IT. He still has nightmares about that preparation room, about bodies sitting up when his back is turned, about corpses trying to stand, about the impossible physics of the dead refusing to stay still. Other embalmers he's talked to since then admit they've seen similar things. Bodies that move when no one's looking, positions that change. Small, subtle shifts that can't be explained by gas or rigor mortis. Most refuse to talk about it publicly. It sounds crazy, unprofessional, like something from a horror movie. But Derek knows what he saw. Bodies that wouldn't stay positioned, a corpse standing beside a table, the sound of footsteps in an empty hallway where only the dead should be. He doesn't work with bodies anymore. Can't. Every time he sees a funeral home, he thinks about those preparation rooms, about embalmers working alone late at night, about bodies on tables that might not stay where they're put. And he wonders if the embalmers who still work in the industry have just gotten used to it. If they've accepted that sometimes the dead move, that sometimes you position a body and turn your back, and when you look again, something has changed. That maybe the dead aren't as still as we think they are. Funeral home workers spend a lot of time alone. Late shifts, overnight hours, working in buildings where most rooms are empty except for the deceased. You get used to the quiet. You get used to being the only living person in the building. But sometimes, that quiet is broken, and when it is, you have to decide, was that sound explainable? Or was it something else? This next story comes from Amanda Chen, who worked as a night attendant at a funeral home in Portland, Oregon in 2019. Amanda's job was simple: be present in the building overnight, answer any emergency calls, and do basic administrative work. She wasn't an embalmer or mortician. She just needed to be there in case a hospital called with a deceased person who needed to be picked up. The funeral home had a large cold storage room where bodies were kept before preparation or cremation. It could hold up to 12 bodies at a time. Amanda rarely needed to go in there. That was the embalmer's job, but she had access in case of emergency. Amanda had been working there for about 3 months when she first heard it. It was around 2 a.m. She was at the front desk doing paperwork when she heard a voice. Muffled, distant, but definitely a voice. It sounded like someone calling out. She couldn't make out words, just the tone. Distressed, urgent. Amanda stood up and listened. Silence. She walked through the building, checking all the rooms. The viewing rooms were empty. The preparation room was locked. The offices were dark. The sound came again, louder this time. And Amanda realized where it was coming from, the cold storage room. Her heart started pounding. There shouldn't be anyone in there. The room was for bodies only. No one had any reason to be inside. She walked to the cooler door and pressed her ear against it. She could hear something. A voice. Definitely a voice. It sounded like someone saying, "Help me." Amanda immediately called her supervisor. While she waited for him to answer, the voice continued, muffled but persistent. "Help me?" Her supervisor answered, groggy. Amanda explained what she was hearing. He told her to open the cooler and check. Maybe somehow someone had gotten locked inside. It had happened once before with a new employee who didn't know the door locked from inside. But Amanda knew the door didn't lock from inside anymore. They'd changed that after the incident. Still, she opened the cooler door. Cold air rushed out. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb. There were 4 bodies in storage, all on gurneys, all covered with white sheets. No living person was in the room. But as Amanda stood in the doorway, she heard it again, the voice. "Help me." It was coming from inside the cooler, from one of the bodies. Amanda's supervisor stayed on the phone with her. "Check the bodies," he said. "Sometimes people are declared dead prematurely. It's rare, but it happens. Check for breathing, for movement." Amanda didn't want to get closer, but she forced herself to approach the first gurney. She pulled back the sheet slightly. The face beneath was gray, lifeless, obviously deceased. No breathing, no movement. She checked the wrist for a pulse, even though she knew it was pointless. Nothing. She moved to the second body. Same result. Clearly dead. The voice spoke again, louder now. "Help me, please." It was coming from the third gurney. Amanda approached slowly. Her hands were shaking as she pulled back the sheet. The body was a man, probably in his 60s. Gray hair, closed eyes, no signs of life. Amanda checked for breath, for pulse. Nothing. But as she stood there, the man's mouth moved. Not opened, not a gasp, just a slight movement of the lips. And the voice came again, seemingly from the body itself. "Help me." Amanda backed away and ran out of the cooler. She told her supervisor she was leaving, that she'd wait outside for him to arrive. Her supervisor came within 20 minutes. Together they went back into the cooler. The supervisor checked all 4 bodies himself. All were definitely deceased. He noted the tag on the third body. The man had been dead for almost 2 days, brought in from a hospice facility. The supervisor couldn't explain what Amanda had heard. He suggested it might have been air escaping from the body's lungs. Sometimes gases cause sounds that can resemble words. It's a known phenomenon. But Amanda knew what she'd heard. It wasn't random gas sounds, it was clear words. "Help me, please." And she'd seen the man's lips move. Over the next few months, Amanda heard the voice multiple times, always at night, always coming from the cooler. Sometimes it was, "Help me." Sometimes it was just groaning sounds. Once, she distinctly heard someone whisper her name, "Amanda." She started refusing to open the cooler at night. If her supervisor asked her to check something, she'd wait until morning, or until someone else was in the building. Other staff members reported hearing strange sounds from the cooler, too. No one wanted to talk about it openly, but in private conversations, Amanda learned that the overnight attendants before her had heard similar things. One had quit because of it. The senior embalmer told Amanda that sometimes deceased persons' vocal cords can create sounds as air moves through them during decomposition. He said it's natural, nothing to fear, but Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that the sounds were too clear, too word-like, too intentional. She quit after 6 months. She now works at a hospital and refuses to take night shifts. She told me she still has nightmares about that cooler. About pulling back sheets to find the source of the voice, about lips moving on gray, lifeless faces, about her own name being whispered by someone who was 2 days dead. The funeral home still operates. New overnight attendants are hired regularly. The turnover is high. Most don't last more than a few months. Amanda wonders if they hear it too, the voice from the cooler. The calls for help from bodies that are definitely, provably dead, but somehow still crying out in the darkness. Most unexplained experiences at funeral homes can be rationalized. Sounds from settling bodies, movement from rigor mortis, the mind playing tricks in dark, quiet buildings. But sometimes, something happens that multiple people witness. Something that can't be dismissed as individual imagination or misperception. Something that an entire staff sees and can't explain. And so to story number 3, the viewing room. This story comes from multiple staff members at a funeral home in Savannah, Georgia in 2018. The funeral home was old, built in the 1920s, and had 3 viewing rooms for services. Viewing room B, the middle room, had a reputation among staff. Weird things happened there, nothing dramatic, but enough that people noticed. Flowers would be found rearranged in the morning. The thermostat would be changed even though it was locked. Chairs would be moved. Small things that could be explained away individually but added up to a pattern. Then came the Reynolds funeral. Margaret Reynolds was a beloved community member who died at age 78. Her family arranged a large viewing on a Friday evening. The funeral home staff set up viewing room B with flowers, a guest book, photo displays, and Margaret's open casket at the front of the room. The viewing was scheduled for 6 to 9 p.m. Family arrived early to have private time. The funeral director, Michael Thornton, showed them into the room at 5:30 p.m. At 5:45 p.m., Margaret's daughter rushed out of the viewing room, visibly upset. She found Michael and said, "Someone's been in the room. Things have been moved." Michael was confused. "What do you mean?" "The flowers?" she said. "They were arranged differently when we walked in. And Mom's hair. It's not how it was earlier today. Someone's touched her." Michael assured her that no one had been in the room since the setup was completed at 4 p.m. He'd locked the door himself, but he went in to check. The flowers did look slightly different, and Margaret's hair, which had been carefully styled by the funeral home's cosmetologist, did seem a bit mussed on one side. Michael apologized and adjusted everything. He assumed staff had gone in to make last-minute changes and hadn't mentioned it. The viewing proceeded normally. About 40 people attended. It was a quiet, respectful service. At 8:30 p.m., as the viewing was winding down, something happened that everyone in the room witnessed. Margaret's hand moved. Not a twitch, not a subtle shift. Her right hand, which had been positioned folded over her left hand on her chest, slowly slid down to her side. The movement was slow, deliberate, taking about 3 seconds. Every person in the room saw it. Several gasped. One woman screamed. Margaret's son rushed to his mother's casket. "She's alive! Mom's alive!" Michael and his assistant immediately checked Margaret. No pulse, no breathing, no signs of life. She was definitely deceased, had been for 3 days. Michael tried to explain it as a natural occurrence. Bodies can shift position as they settle. Rigor mortis wears off and muscles relax. It's uncommon, but possible. But Margaret's daughter wasn't having it. "We've been here for 3 hours. Why would her hand suddenly move now?" And it didn't just fall. It moved slowly, like she was repositioning herself. Michael had no good answer. He repositioned Margaret's hands and apologized for the distress. The guests left shortly after, shaken. The family requested the casket be closed for the funeral the next day. But that night, the overnight attendant, a woman named Lisa, reported something even stranger. At 2 a.m., Lisa was walking past viewing room B when she heard sounds from inside. Music. Very faint, like someone had left a phone playing music in the room. Lisa unlocked the room and turned on the lights. The room was empty except for Margaret's closed casket. No music, no sound at all. Lisa turned off the lights and locked the door. But as she walked away, she heard it again. Music, coming from the viewing room. She went back in. Silence. This happened 3 more times that night. Every time Lisa walked past the room, she'd hear music. Every time she entered, it would stop. The next morning, Lisa mentioned it to Michael. He was skeptical, but agreed to check the room. During the funeral service that afternoon, nothing unusual happened. Margaret was buried without incident. But over the following weeks, other staff members reported experiences in viewing room B. The overnight attendants consistently heard sounds from that room. Music, whispers, footsteps. The day staff would find flowers rearranged or chairs moved. One embalmer reported preparing a body in the adjacent preparation room and hearing the door to viewing room B open and close repeatedly, even though he was alone in the building and the door was locked. The funeral home director eventually had the room blessed by a local priest. The experiences continued. Michael still works at that funeral home. He told me that staff now avoid viewing room B when possible. They'll use it if necessary, but everyone prefers rooms A or C. Room B is saved for smaller services where there's no alternative. When I asked Michael if he believes the room is haunted, he was careful with his answer. "I don't know what to call it," he said, "but something happens in that room that doesn't happen in the others." And after the Reynolds viewing, after everyone in the room saw Margaret's hand move, I stopped trying to explain it away. The overnight attendants who hear music from the room have learned to just walk past it. Don't investigate, don't engage. Just accept that sometimes, in viewing room B, there are sounds that don't have sources. Margaret's family never learned about the additional occurrences. They believed their mother's hand movement was just a natural settling of the body, as Michael explained. But the staff knows differently. They saw how slowly and deliberately that hand moved. They heard the music that night. They've experienced the ongoing strangeness of that room. And they wonder if Margaret is somehow still there, if something about her passing left an imprint in that room, if the dead sometimes linger in the places where people gather to say goodbye to them. Working alone in a funeral home at night means you become familiar with every sound, every creak, every normal noise the building makes. You learn what's ordinary and what isn't. But sometimes you encounter something so far outside the realm of ordinary that you can't rationalize it. Something that makes you question whether you're ever truly alone, even when you know you should be. Story number 4, The Knock, comes from Robert Hayes, who worked as a night security guard at a funeral home in Boston, Massachusetts in 2020. Robert's job was straightforward: patrol the building every 2 hours, monitor security cameras, and respond to any alarms. The funeral home was in a renovated Victorian mansion and had multiple floors with viewing rooms, offices, and a basement preparation area. Robert had been working there for about a year when he started hearing the knocking. It would happen around 3 a.m., always the same time. 3 knocks, in quick succession, like someone rapping their knuckles on wood. The first time Robert heard it, he assumed someone was outside. He checked the front entrance, the back door, the side doors. All were locked. No one was visible on the security cameras. The knocking came again. 3 knocks. Definitely coming from inside the building. Robert searched every room on the first floor. Nothing. He went upstairs. Nothing. He checked the basement. Nothing. But every time he returned to the security office, he'd hear it again. 3 knocks. Always the same rhythm. Always the same volume. This continued for weeks. Every single night around 3 a.m., the knocking would start. Sometimes it lasted 5 minutes. Sometimes an hour. But it was always the same pattern. 3 knocks, pause. 3 knocks, pause. Robert reported it to management. They suggested it might be pipes, the heating system, or the building settling. But Robert knew building sounds. He'd worked security for years. This was different. This sounded exactly like someone knocking on a door. One night, Robert decided to figure out where the sound was coming from. He left the security office and stood in the main hallway, listening. The knocking started. 3 knocks. Robert turned toward the sound. It was coming from the basement stairs. He walked to the basement door and opened it. The knocking continued, definitely coming from below. Robert descended the stairs slowly. The basement was dimly lit, containing the preparation room, storage areas, and the old crematorium that was no longer in use. The knocking grew louder as Robert approached the old crematorium door. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. It was coming from inside the crematorium. Robert stood outside the door, listening. The knocking continued. Someone, something, was inside the crematorium, knocking on the inside of the door. Robert tried to open the door. It was locked. He didn't have a key. The crematorium had been sealed for years after the funeral home switched to a contracted cremation service. He radioed management and described what he was hearing. They told him to wait, that they'd send someone with keys in the morning. But Robert had to know. He found a toolkit and used a screwdriver to remove the door hinges. The door came free. Robert pulled it open. The crematorium interior was dark, dusty, and obviously hadn't been used in years. No one was inside. Nothing that could produce knocking sounds. But as Robert stood in the doorway, the knocking happened again. 3 knocks. Loud. Deliberate. And Robert realized, with horror, that the sound wasn't coming from inside the crematorium. It was coming from the crematorium itself. From the furnace chamber where bodies used to be placed for cremation. The furnace door was sealed with a heavy iron latch. Robert approached it slowly. The knocking continued. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Someone, or something, was inside the furnace, knocking on the door from the inside. Robert didn't open the furnace. He backed out of the crematorium, replaced the door, and radioed for his supervisor to come immediately. When the supervisor arrived 2 hours later, they opened the furnace together. It was empty, just old ash residue and metal. The knocking had stopped. Management checked records and found that the crematorium had been shut down after a malfunction 10 years earlier. A body had been placed in the furnace for cremation, but the furnace had failed to ignite. When staff discovered the issue, they found the body still intact in the chamber. But the deceased man's family insisted they'd heard their father's voice that night, calling out in distress. The family filed a complaint claiming their father had been alive when placed in the furnace. An investigation found no evidence to support this. The man had been dead for 2 days before cremation. But the incident had spooked the funeral home enough that they'd sealed the crematorium and contracted cremations to another facility. Robert quit shortly after learning this. He couldn't work in a building where, every night at 3 a.m., someone knocked from inside a sealed crematorium furnace, where the knocking followed the exact pattern you'd expect from someone trapped, desperate, pounding on metal to be let out. The funeral home hired a new night guard. Robert heard through colleagues that the new guard also reported hearing knocking at 3 a.m., and like Robert, he eventually traced it to the old crematorium. The building still operates as a funeral home. The crematorium remains sealed, but every night, around 3 a.m., if you're in that basement, you can allegedly hear it. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Someone who wants out, someone who's been knocking for 10 years. Someone who won't stop until the furnace door opens and whatever is inside is finally released. Robert never went back. He can't. Every time he's in a quiet space around 3 a.m., he listens for it. The knocking. The pattern. The sound of someone desperate to escape from a place no one should ever have been trapped in. The final story I'm sharing tonight is different from the others. It doesn't involve sounds or movement or unexplained phenomena. It involves something the embalmer saw that shouldn't have been possible. Something that made him question not just what happens at funeral homes, but what happens to us after we die. This story comes from James Parrish, a veteran embalmer with over 25 years of experience in Charleston, South Carolina. James had embalmed thousands of bodies over his career. He'd seen everything: peaceful deaths, violent deaths, bodies in every possible condition. Nothing surprised him anymore. Death was his job, and he approached it with clinical professionalism. In 2021, James was called to embalm a woman named Catherine Moore. She died in her home at age 65, apparently from a heart attack. Standard case. When James began the embalming process, he noted Catherine's expression. Her face was relaxed, neutral, typical for someone who died suddenly. Her eyes were closed. Her mouth was slightly open, which is common and easily corrected. James worked methodically, following the same procedures he'd done thousands of times. Arterial injection, drainage, cavity embalming positioning. The process took about 2 hours. When James had finished and was doing the final positioning and cosmetic work, he looked at Catherine's face and froze. Her expression had changed. Catherine was smiling, not a slight curve of the lips that could be explained by muscle relaxation. A clear, unmistakable smile. The corners of her mouth were turned up, her face had a peaceful, almost content appearance. James knew this was impossible. He'd seen her face at the start of the embalming. It had been neutral. He'd manipulated her facial muscles during the process. He knew exactly how her face had been positioned. But now, she was smiling. James tried to rationalize it. Maybe the embalming fluid had caused tissues to contract in a way that created the appearance of a smile. Maybe he'd inadvertently positioned the muscles differently than he remembered. But James knew faces, he knew death, and this wasn't a natural occurrence. He gently manipulated Catherine's facial muscles, trying to return her expression to neutral. The smile remained. No matter how he adjusted the tissues, Catherine's face settled back into that peaceful, content smile. James finished his work and documented the case. He didn't mention the smile in his notes. Catherine's viewing was 2 days later. The family commented on how peaceful she looked, how it seemed like she was smiling. They said it was perfect. Their mother had always been such a happy person. James accepted their gratitude but said nothing about what he'd experienced. A week later, James received a call from Catherine's daughter. She thanked him again for his work and told him something that made his blood run cold. The day before her mother died, Catherine had called her daughter and said she'd had a dream. In the dream, she'd died, but she wasn't afraid. She said she'd seen something, a light, a presence, something beautiful, and she knew death wasn't the end. She told her daughter she was ready, and when her time came, she'd be at peace. Catherine died the next morning. Her daughter said seeing her mother smiling in the casket had confirmed what Catherine had told her, that their mother had found the peace she'd seen in her dream. James didn't tell the daughter what he'd seen, how her mother's face had been neutral at the start of embalming, how the smile had appeared during the process, how it couldn't be removed no matter how he tried. Since then, James has paid closer attention to the expressions of the deceased he embalms, and he's noticed something he'd never focused on before. Some bodies seem to change expression during the embalming process. Not all, not even most. But occasionally, a face that starts neutral will end peaceful, or a face that starts tense will end relaxed. Changes that shouldn't be possible with deceased tissues, changes that seem to reflect something James can't explain. James still works as an embalmer. He's one of the best in Charleston. But Catherine Moore's case changed how he views his work. He used to see bodies as biological machines that had stopped functioning. Now he wonders if something lingers, consciousness, spirit, awareness, something that remains present even as he does his work. He wonders if the people he embalms know what's happening to them, if they can feel or sense or somehow experience the process. If Catherine's smile was her way of communicating that she was at peace, that everything was okay, that death wasn't what she'd feared. James doesn't talk about this with other embalmers. It sounds too spiritual, too unscientific for the clinical world of mortuary science, but in private moments, when he's working alone in the preparation room, he sometimes speaks to the deceased. Not prayers or rituals, just simple acknowledgments. I'll take care of you. You're safe here. Your family will see you looking peaceful. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he swears he sees a subtle change in expression, a slight easing of tension, a hint of peace settling over features that had been troubled. James is retiring next year. He's trained dozens of embalmers over his career, but he's never told any of them about Catherine Moore, about the smile that appeared where there shouldn't have been one, about his belief that sometimes, maybe, the dead aren't as far gone as we think they are, that maybe consciousness lingers for a while, that maybe they know we're taking care of them, that maybe they can find peace even in death, and sometimes that peace shows on their faces in ways that biological processes can't explain. When James leaves the profession, he'll take that observation with him, the knowledge that sometimes, in the quiet preparation rooms where the living care for the dead, something unexplainable happens. A smile appears, an expression shifts, a face at rest finds peace that wasn't there before, and maybe, just maybe, that means something more than we're willing to admit. 5 funeral home workers, 5 experiences they can't explain, 5 moments when the boundary between life and death seemed thinner than it should be. Most people will never work in a funeral home, never spend time alone with the deceased, never experience the unique quiet of buildings where death is always present. But those who do, the embalmers, the attendants, the directors, they all have stories. Moments when something happened that shouldn't be possible. Sounds from empty rooms, movements from still bodies, changes that defy biological explanation. Most won't talk about it publicly. It sounds unprofessional. Sounds like imagination or superstition. But in private, away from families and the public, they'll admit it. Working with the dead isn't always as straightforward as it seems. Sometimes the bodies move. Sometimes voices come from cold storage. Sometimes smiles appear where there were none. And sometimes you realize you might not be as alone in those preparation rooms as you thought you were. The funeral home workers who shared these stories still work in the industry. They've learned to accept the unexplainable. They do their jobs with professionalism and care. But they know something most people don't. They know that death isn't always the clear ending we think it is. That maybe something lingers. That maybe the dead aren't as silent as they appear. And late at night, in empty funeral homes across the country, maybe that's exactly what's happening.
Thanks for watching. Every ending hides the beginning of another tale, and ours is already on its way. Stay tuned. You'll find the next chapter right here, and soon.